the people of Georgia are going to elect Brian Kemp.
I blow up government spending.
There's actually no record of her whatsoever voting in any election. It's horrible.
I gotta show this to you.
The Republican officials, they have begun a process of removing voters who they claim may have voted in 2 states.
So the fact that our Secretary of State is undertaking to purge 500,000 voters should be deeply concerning.
The card simply says that you may be registered in state A and state B.
I never received a postcard. I won't be able to vote for the November 6th election.
What's this postcard business? That's the key.
Sir, why do we have to sue you to get the names of voters who've been removed? Are you removing black voters from the voter rolls just so you can win this election?
You put Stacey in there, and you're going to have Georgia turn into Venezuela.
Stacey.
We're not going to let them steal this election. We're going to stand up for what's right here.
I will vote.
She held civil rights meetings at her home. And today to come out and not be able to vote bothers me. It bothers me to my core.
Welcome, everyone, to what I know is going to be an exciting and historic live broadcast. How Trump Stole 2020, published today, is the result of 20 years of investigations, and it tells a story that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. As Greg Palast, editor and publisher at 7 Stories Press, I want to thank Greg for what he gets up and does to put this story in front of people every single day. And I want to thank Noam and Amy for what they do every day and for taking the time and insisting on the importance of Greg's work and this topic, which is connected so viscerally to everything we're fighting for in 2020. I also want to thank the many people who worked on this event and this book launch, Ruth and Allison from 7 Stories, Amy's producer, Dennis, Valeria Chomsky, Lenny, Nicole, Carrie, Anne, John from Greg's organization, and our participating independent booksellers, Book Passage from Santa Cruz, Third Place Books in Seattle, and Word Up in Washington Heights and New York City. I also want to thank Jacobin Magazine and Project Censored for co-sponsoring this event with us, and a special shout out to Ted Rall, political commentator and illustrator, artist who created the brilliant 48-page comic book that is the book's centerfold. Amy Goodman does as much to ensure that there's a fourth estate in America as anyone alive. She's the host and executive producer of Democracy Now!, a national, daily, independent, award-winning news program airing on over 1,400 public television and radio stations worldwide. Amy's the recipient of many awards of international reporting for clarity in public language and for creative citizenship, including a Neiman Foundation honor, the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence Lifetime Achievement Award, and she was the first journalist to win the Right Livelihood Award. She's written or co-written 6 best-selling books, the latest of which is Democracy Now!, 20 years covering the movements changing America. Amy.
Thank you so much, Dan, and what an honor it is to be here today with you, with Greg Palast, and with Noam Chomsky for this, what I look forward to very much, this discussion. Well, beloved around the world for the strength of his personal commitment to the truth and for the brilliance of his ideas, Noam Chomsky is an American linguist, an activist, a political philosopher. A professor of linguistics and philosophy at MIT for more than half a century, he's currently a professor at the University of Arizona, Tucson. Among his many change-making books is Requiem for the American Dream, which has taken on new significance, to say the least, in the present moment, and has been cited by students as opening their eyes to inequality. It has also been made into a popular film. And then there is, well, none other than, well, let's say Secretary of State for Florida, Katherine Harris, once called Greg Palast twisted, and maniacal. She's the one who certified the election of George Bush over Al Gore. But The Guardian called Greg the most important investigative reporter of our time. For The Guardian, BBC Television, Rolling Stone, and our own Democracy Now! NewsHour, Greg Palast, with his signature fedora, has been hunting down racist vote trickery for 20 years, beginning with his busting the Bush family's theft of Florida in 2000. Esquire magazine wrote, Greg Palast is one of those inconveniently stubborn journalists who gets his teeth into a story and shakes it bloody right there in the middle of the parlor, dreadfully inconveniencing the pampered swells of the elite political press. Greg Palast is unique among investigative reporters because he was a real-life investigator and detective for the U.S. Justice Department and others, directing billion-dollar racketeering cases. He knows his stuff. He was a protege of Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago, lectured at Cambridge, Oxford, and Harvard, authored 4 New York Times best-selling books, including The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. Greg Palast is a Puffin Foundation Fellow. His work is followed worldwide. Just last year, the Mexican Association of Journalists named Greg Palast their International Reporter of the Year. Today, Greg Palast has released his latest book, already climbing to the top of the bestseller list, How Trump Stole 2020, The Hunt for America's Vanished Voters. And here's Greg Palast with a few words of warning from the opening of his book, How Trump Stole 2020.
Wow, thank you, Amy, very much for that. And so, okay, chapter 2 is America, You Are Not Guilty. So I'm going to read you one page. America, let's talk. I get it. You're stunned you elected an orange-stained, gelatinous bag of malicious mendacity, a snorting porcine pile, pustule of bloviating bigot, hinged to grasping little griplets, a bloated ball of gracelessness and crybaby petulance as President of the United States. America, you can stop hiding your face now. You're not guilty. Trump didn't win in 2016, and I'm not talking about Trump losing the popular vote. Trump lost the Electoral College. That is, he lost, if you count all the votes, he burgled, jacked, swiped, shoplifted, purloined, filched, fiddled, and snatched from citizens not of a whitish orange hue. And unless we wise up, 2020 will be deja vu all over again. So we're here to wise up. Thank you, Amy.
And thank you, Greg. This is the book, How Trump Stole 2020. And we're going to begin with the first question to Noam Chomsky. Noam, can you talk about Greg's book?
First of all, it's a really great and eye-opening and illuminating book. Everyone should read it carefully. Like even the greatest work, it has flaws. One of the flaws is it's quite unfair to the Republican Party and to the Clinton Democrats. It fails to recognize that they are minority parties. They recognize it. Trump said it about the Republicans. He said, there's a fair election, you'll never get a Republican voted. But one of the most powerful chapters in the book is about the California Democrats, who, according to Greg's analysis, stole more votes than the Republicans probably put together. But they're a minority party. There was no other way to keep Sanders out. There's no other way for the Republicans to keep a Democrat out. So you have to be fair. They just have no other means. And furthermore, they're acting on principle. The principle actually has constitutional roots. It has roots in what's called progressive democratic theory. It has roots in Econ 101. It's a principle that says if you don't keep the rich happy, you're in trouble. And there's plenty of evidence for that. So take, say, Allende's Chile. You don't keep the rich happy, money flows out of the country, nobody invests, international investors don't give you a cent. Then comes efforts to overthrow the government. You just got to keep the rich happy. And the Republicans, who are totally dedicated to the welfare of the ultra-rich and the corporate sector, understand that. They're also what are called originalists. They go back, they're very much concerned with our Constitution, what the framers thought. They probably don't know this because they don't bother reading. But if they did bother reading, they would find that the Constitution is founded on the principle that it's necessary to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. James Madison, the main framer, Alexander Hamilton, other major framer, we have to protect the rich against the depredations that the democratic spirit might lead people who don't own property to act against property. In fact, the major scholarly work on the Constitution, Michael Klarman's great book, gold standard of scholarship, is called The Framers' Coup, how the framers carried out a coup against democracy. There's more to say about this. If there's time, I'll go on. But if you accept the principle that guides the Republican Party and the California Democrats, that it's very important to serve the master, the very rich, the corporate sector, you have to keep them in place, then it's very important to do what's called democratic theory tells you to do, liberal democratic theory. You have to marginalize the public. The public are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders. They're stupid and ignorant. They don't understand. Their job is to be spectators, not participants. Maybe they push a lever now and then, but then they're supposed to go home. That's people like Walter Lippmann, the leading liberal public intellectual of the 20th century, Reinhold Niebuhr. We have to feed the stupid public with necessary illusions, emotionally potent simplifications, and if we can't do that, just take away their votes. So there's a kind of a rationale behind it. Have to be fair. If we're going to serve the masters abjectly, then what can you do? You're a minority. You have to carry out something like the framers' coup against democracy. And what Greg has shown is they're doing it very successfully, just by stealing the votes of the wrong people. So we could look at it that way and say that a very serious flaw in the study.
Yeah, well, one of the things, two things, Noam, you mentioned the Democrats. There's a chapter in there, as you talked about California, called California Riemann. And even though the book is mostly about Republican vote thievery, because they're the ones that have the advantage in removing black voters and young voters and other voters of color. In California, here where I'm at in Hollywood, we have a Democratic Secretary of State who his wipeout of voters probably equals most of the Republican vote theft nationwide put together. We had 1 million votes, people shunted to provisional ballots in California. According to my calculations, Bernie Sanders was cheated out about 553,000 votes by the brilliant vote suppression techniques here during the primary. But of course, in the general, it's the GOP. When we talk about following the money, I have several chapters on the money because people, I'm going to tell you, people don't steal elections, Noam, as you well know. They're not stealing votes to steal elections. They're stealing votes to steal the money. So, for example, I have chapters on Billy Koch, one of the few guys, we talk about Charles and David Koch all the time, but it was Billy Koch who was the money behind Donald Trump. The two brothers were never Trumpers, but Billy Koch runs probably the filthiest corporation in America, Oxbow Carbon. He needed the XL pipeline, so he needed himself a president, and that's why he was backing Agent Orange as president. So it's very important. Even when you're doing my vote theft investigations, it's all about following the money, and so there you go. By the way, Noam, before we had spoken, you said the book was scary. Why is it scary?
Well, it's scary because it brings to us the evidence about the truth of the doctrine that the people have to be marginalized, that democracy is very dangerous, and in order to serve the interests of the ultra-rich and the corporate sector, we have to do what we can to prevent democracy. The California Democrats, I think it's one of the most interesting chapters in the book. As you say, they probably outdid all the Republicans together in eliminating votes. But how else are you going to keep Sanders out? If you had a democracy, Sanders would have won. And then the rich would be unhappy. And the corporate sector wouldn't like it. In fact, I'm sure you saw a couple of days ago, there was a front page article in the New York Times saying that the investor class is beginning to get nervous because they think Trump might not win. And that means the cornucopia might be slightly closed. Instead of a vast sum of money coming into their pockets, beyond the dreams of avarice, it might be only a little less. And they've got to do something. So I'm sure that tons of money are pouring in to prevent this terrible outcome. And if it's necessary to steal votes, what else can you do? So since the concept of irony has been lost in the country, let me say this is ironic, okay? Before somebody quotes it in the front page of a newspaper, okay? But, this is the background. And yes, these people who are determined to destroy democracy, like, what's his name, Alex Padilla, Brian Kemp, the rest of them, have no other technique except stealing votes. Your journalistic colleagues prefer, as you point out, prefer to look the other way. And have the evidence in front of them, but it doesn't come through. We look at something else. Well, okay, that's a way of abetting the crime against democracy. Or from another point of view, saving the principle that what matters is the welfare of the super rich and the corporate sector. That's basically the choice we have.
I wanted to ask Greg, because unlike Noam, a lot of people haven't yet read the book. It's just coming out. And Greg, I wanted to ask you about the origins of the book, why you chose to write it, and then explain, how did Trump steal 2020?
I was going to do another book, and then I saw that this was happening. Now, understand, it's called How Trump Stole 2020. The reason I wrote the book is that it's not a prediction, Amy. I don't have crystal balls here. It's a fact. He already stole it. And that's why the first chapter is simply the election. Donald Trump won re-election in November 2018, 2 years before any vote was taken, 2 years ago. What happened was, and you saw in the little film that we opened up with in Georgia, that's where they took the new vote thieving technique for a test drive. In 2018, the Supreme Court allowed GOP secretaries of state vote operatives like Brian Kemp and the little Catherine Harrises that are running our election system, and said that they could begin purging voters with a new system. Brian Kemp took it for a test drive, removed 500,000 voters in Georgia. And in fact, you carried my report, Amy. It was carried on Democracy Now! When I did jump Brian Kemp, asked him if he was removing voters of color, young voters, to steal the election. I had to sue him. I won a federal court case, got the records, and found that he had illegally removed 340,134 voters. Let me repeat that, 340,000. We weren't sampling, went through name by name by name, and determined, they said these people had moved away. They hadn't left Georgia. They were still there. We could prove it. In fact, I went to the polling station, and this is what really kind of forced it. You saw that woman in tears and her aunt, 92 years old. This is Martin Luther King's cousin, voting for the 50th year in the same schoolhouse in Atlanta. They threw her out. The 50th year since her cousin 50 years since her cousin was murdered. She was the cousin of Martin Luther King. He used to come over to her house, and after he sermonized at the Ebenezer Baptist Church, he would have his Sunday dinner there. They threw her out. And then what I found out is that once Brian Kemp became governor, he beat Stacey Abrams. And even she said, citing my 340,000 illegal removals, she said, I won, but I won't be inaugurated. But it's not a Georgia story. That people didn't understand. That was the test run for the national rollout of this massive purge. Are you ready? Write this number down. 16.7 million people have been removed from the voter rolls in the past 2 years. By the way, that's not from my black helicopter, Amy. That's from the United States Elections Assistance Commission. 16.7 million voters, 1 in 12. If you think you're going to mail in your ballot, not if you're purged and you don't know it. You can't mail in your ballot if you don't get it. And they're not going to send that to you if you're purged. And it is overwhelmingly voters of color and young people. And I was just in, and then I went to Milwaukee, and where I found, and you'll see, we'll bring up some of that tape later, but where they're saying 150,000 people have moved, left the state or left their home county. They haven't gone anywhere. For example, I had Sequana Taylor. They said it left Milwaukee. And I asked Sequana, did you leave Milwaukee? You know, you shouldn't be voting in Milwaukee if you left Milwaukee. She says, I don't think I've left Milwaukee, Mr. Palast. I'm the county supervisor of Milwaukee. But she is an African-American woman, so she's definitely guilty of voting while black. So I see this all around the country. Votes not being counted, being deep sixed. People being thrown, 1 million provisional ballots were thrown out. It's all the new Jim Crow. It is a Jim Crow operation, and unless we can blow the whistle on it, we can't reverse it. So the point of how Trump stole 2020, the reason I wrote it is that he did steal it, but we can steal it back. That is, we can bust the burglary and reverse it. We can. And that's why I wrote the book.
So how do you reverse it?
Okay, so there's a bunch of things. Well, first of all, at the back of the book, you know, it's probably the most important thing is here at the back. I don't know if you can see it, but it is Greg and Ted's new improved ballot condom to protect your vote, for safe voting. And no, Amy, you don't put the ballot condom, rip it out and put it around the ballot. It shows you how to save your vote. Number one, if you've been purged, you don't know it. I looked my name up, Greg Palast, and it said here in California, no such voter. That was me too. So King's cousin, Sequana Taylor, they didn't know that they were purged, and they show up to vote and they lose it. So now everyone watching this, please check your registration right now. Go online to your Secretary of State, your Board of Elections, check your registration. If you ain't there, re-register online on the spot, make a screenshot of that. That's just the beginning. And then we have to make sure, especially with mail-in balloting, Amy, we can get it further into that, but 22% of all mail-in ballots, 22%, that's 1 out of 5, according to MIT, Caltech studies, don't get counted. How do we make sure that our votes, especially if we go from just 20 million people voting by mail, 40 million people voting by mail, to 80 million people voting by mail, how do we prevent millions of votes not being counted? So
what do you mean you don't count it?
Well, literally. Okay. First of all, you can't mail in your ballot if it's not mailed out to you. And according to MIT, about 1 in 10 mail-in ballots, it's crazy, never get to the voter. 1 in 10. And I can tell you, I just spoke to to Andrea Young. She's the executive director of ACLU of Georgia. She put in for her vote for her and her husband 45 days before the Georgia primary, June 9th primary. Her husband, this is the head of the ACLU, got his ballot on June 10. So he ended up waiting in line with all his other voters. When you saw those lines, Amy, in Georgia, it wasn't because black folk like to sit in humid rain for 4 hours to vote. They did ask for their ballots. Almost everyone we spoke to said the same thing. I asked for a ballot. I never got it. 1 in 10 people ask for it, don't get it. And on top of that, another 1 in 10 or 1 in 9, you mail in your ballot, they don't count it. They don't count it. I mean, this is the secret of American democracy, the nasty little secret, Amy. We don't count all the votes. We don't count all the votes. So they come up with cockamamie reasons to throw out your ballot. And I got to tell you, it can happen to anyone. My sister's a lawyer, lost her mail-in vote in California because she didn't properly fill in the bubble. Don't put an X, don't put a check mark, don't put a smiley face, as it says in the ballot condom. If it says fill in the bubble, fill in the bubble. Put in the right postage. You know, 100,000 people lost their right to vote because of because of postage due. Now, Amy, if it's anyone losing their votes, then it's random. Who cares? Doesn't change the election. It's not random. We disqualified 1.9 million in-precinct votes in 2016, not anyone's vote. According to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, if you're black, the chance your vote will be disqualified is 900% higher. This is in the book. 900% higher if you're white than if you're black. 500% higher if you're Hispanic than if you're white. So wait, let me get that right. 900% higher, more likely that you will have your vote disqualified if you're black than if you're white. 500% more likely to have your vote disqualified if you're Hispanic than if you're white. And if you're Native American, I can tell you as a former statistician, as professor of statistics, it's almost uncountable how terrible the non-count of American Native votes is. And those are in swing states like Arizona and New Mexico. I had precincts in New Mexico for Native Americans where there was not one vote for president. Do you think that American natives don't, and the indigenous people in the Pueblo population of New Mexico don't want to pick their president? This is what's happening in America.
What is happening there?
So what we're having is, and in the book I have a very exacting breakdown. In 2016, according to the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission, we lost 5.8 million votes altogether, thrown out. 3 million mail-in ballots were disqualified. 2 million in-precinct ballots were disqualified. So you had 5 million ballots chucked out. Then you had a couple million voters blocked from voting. They don't like your ID. They also threw out 1 million provisional ballots, as I've said. Those are the ballots. And again, it's not random. It's not random, Amy. As you find in the book, you meet the people that get thrown out, that get provisional ballots, like Raheem Shabazz in the guy you saw in the little film in Atlanta. Okay, he moved down the street. You don't have to re-register if you move within your neighborhood. But they took away his vote because they knew what neighborhood he moved into. And so they said you can get a provisional ballot. But here's the problem. Federal law requires that if your name's missing from the voter rolls, they have to give you a provisional ballot. Georgia rules, which were set by Brian Kemp, and remember, he's the candidate. The candidate says, but those ballots can't be counted. So you have the right to the ballot, but they don't get counted. 935,000 provisional ballots were not counted in 2016. It's going to be worse this year. And I got to tell you, again, everything is down to race. And that's what my fellow reporters are not covering. It's race. If you are Hispanic, you're 300% more likely to get a provisional ballot. 250% more likely if you're black than if you're white to get a provisional ballot. And again, they reject almost 1 million of them. That's what's happening in America. It's apartheid elections, but it's very, very sophisticated. But we have ways of undoing the Jim Crow operation.
You have a chapter, Eric Crow, Jim Crow's liberal twin. What do you mean?
Oh, boy. Okay. Well, this will keep me off NPR. Well, you all know the Pew Charitable Trust. They are the big money behind National Petroleum Radio and the Petroleum Broadcast System. And they came up with a list. The Pew Trust decided, they're going to help the poor little low-income voters, help them vote. Good liberals. So they came up with lists, which they handed out to states, saying, here are people who've moved into your states. You know what the GOP did? They said, thank you very much. This is a mover list. And the state of Wisconsin passed a law saying anyone on the Pew Charity mover list has to be removed from the voter rolls. So the nice Pew Trust, the liberals, ended up providing hit lists to 27 states. And at least a dozen of them are removing voters that they say have moved because they got their names from the Pew Trust. Well, I had a team of experts. You'll see in the book, I had a team of experts going over the list to see if people really moved. And by the way, it's easy to find out if you've really moved. There's experts in this field. They work for Amazon. They work for eBay. We got the Amazon, eBay experts. I hired them to say, okay, you guys know exactly where people live. They use 200 databases. Amazon knows where you were last Thursday at 2 p.m., by the way. I hate to break this news to you. So we asked them, can you go through the purge list and tell us where these voters are? And they said, this purge list is 74% wrong. They gave me every single name and address of wrongly removed voters in Atlanta, and throughout Georgia and throughout Wisconsin. But again, some of these lists are provided of all places by the Pew Charitable Trust. So when liberals try to improve things, like liberals came up with the Help America Vote Act and the provisional ballot, but they got the right to the ballot. They didn't get the right to get it counted. Now they come up with a list of people who are moving. The idea is to send them postcards, say, would you like to register to vote? And they use it as a hit list. This is the ugly stuff that's going. That's where Sequana Taylor, the supervisor in Milwaukee, she was on that list, on the Pew Charitable Trust list, saying that she had left Milwaukee. I don't think so.
So, Noam, why isn't the Democratic Party screaming right now about this? We are just months away from the 2020 election.
Take a look at California. They're participating. There's one qualification to what Greg said about it being a race-based robbery. It's also a class-based robbery, and that's what lies behind it. You don't want the blacks to vote because they vote the wrong way, but you don't want whites to vote if they're going to vote for Bernie Sanders. Now, that's the California story, and as Greg points out, demonstrates in the book, California probably outmatches the whole Republican robbery. So there's deep issues involved. Why the Democrats aren't stealing? They're part of the game. The new Democrats, that is, the Clinton wing of the Democratic Party, the moderate Republicans, there actually is a new Democratic Party arising. Sanders is the main figure, but it's basically the activists on the ground who've made a big difference. If you look at the Democratic Party program today, it's been pressed farther to the left than practically any president, and not because the DNC had a conversion, but because they're being pressed by people on the ground. People from Sunrise Movement, from other activist groups are just forcing it. And as Greg pointed out, importantly, you can change these things. I mean, I quoted before the framers' coup against democracy, but history didn't end then. There was a major popular reaction to it. And over the years, those barriers to democracy were reduced. It wasn't easy. It's very hard work. And Greg points out in the book that it wasn't until the, correct me if I'm wrong, 1850s, 1860s, that you could get Catholics and Jews voting in some states.
Actually, in fact, Noam, we had, I can't remember whether it's Virginia, a couple states didn't allow Catholics to vote until after black people were allowed to vote under the Constitution. And yeah, exactly. And by the way, American natives are only given citizenship in 1926 and the right to the vote in 1964, a year before the Voting Rights Act.
Mm-hmm. It's a lot more like this. I mean, federal law required that blacks couldn't enter federally funded housing until the late 1960s. They missed out on the whole period of house purchasing, which is the basis for wealth in the United States. One of the reasons for the shocking legacy of 400 years. But the point is, a lot of these things, as one of the good points, important points in the book, is it can be overcome. It's going to take a struggle. In fact, going back to something else you point out, which I think is very important, you were talking about registration. Why have registration? Other countries don't have it. You pointed out even North Dakota doesn't have it. This is just another technique to prevent the wrong people from voting.
That's right.
Dismantle that. We should dismantle having the voting day on a day when everybody's at work, which automatically cuts out a lot of people. There's a whole complicated system of preventing the wrong people from voting, which is all built on the principle that Madison, in fact, elucidated. You have to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority. democracy is a very dangerous thing.
Yeah, it's about, as I say in the book, while I talk about race, because it's really about power. And the reason why the wealthy go after African-American voters is that they're politically vulnerable. So, for example, back in 2000, when I uncovered that Katherine Harris and Jeb Bush had removed tens of thousands of black people from the voter rolls, calling them felons who had no right to vote. And I want to tell you something. The New York Times finally picked up the story and said the list was flawed. No, sorry, Times. It was fraud. There wasn't one single illegal voter, but all the voters had BLA next to their name for black on their registrations. That's what elected George Bush as president. Now, by removing tens of thousands of black voters, but he supposedly won by 537 votes. But why pick on black voters? I can tell you, the chairman of the Democratic Party says, I can't get one white Democratic politicians to defend these voters because it's very easy to accuse black people of having felony records, even though it wasn't true at all. So it's a vulnerable group of people that politicians won't defend, including within the Democratic Party. And that's a huge problem. So it is, you're right, it's about power and class. But in America, the mark of class is race. And that's why I concentrate on race. That's the trick, because you can't get defenders of voters of color. This is what we're missing in America.
Now, you work with Stacey Abrams in Georgia.
Yes.
You sued the governor. You sued Kemp. What happened?
Yes. Well, I myself sued before I worked with Stacey Abrams to get the documents. And Brian Kemp, who is now the governor, was Secretary of State. And I make fun of his accent. I usually don't make fun of accents, but this guy's accent is phony. He used to have a New South Jimmy Carter accent. But then he decided to talk like it's from Dogpatch to fool the goobers. That's the guy, as you saw in the commercial, who says, I got me a pickup truck to round up illegal aliens myself. I just said that. So that's all phony. Okay, but I sued him and to open up his files, and the judge was so annoyed. The federal judge, basically, she accused him of lying and ordered a summary judgment. She said, "There's no trial. Palast has won. Give him his documents and pay his lawyers." I took that. We analyzed it. We found out that we got the names of people like Mrs. Jordan's King's cousin, who were removed illegally from the voter rolls, and then Stacey Abrams asked us to bring our experts over and work with them, which we were happy to do. So it's there's that legal fight, but I'm going to tell you right now, we got to fight ours. We can't wait for the outcome of these court cases. What we have to do, the ACLU is also picking up a lot of this material, but we have to act ourselves now through agitation, education, and I told you, check your registration.
Let me ask you about mail-in voting. You talk about the dangers of mail-in voting, which, of course, is what President Trump does. Of course, President Trump, his family members, his press secretary, they all vote mail-in. And right now, in this era of COVID, who is most vulnerable to COVID? Well, it's people of color and poorer communities. And there is a big push that people should be able to mail in and not stand on these extended lines with much fewer polling places. But talk about your concerns, Greg. Okay, so do understand that I don't agree with Donald Trump, but here's the issue, because remember, he has in case you haven't noticed, he's a psychotic narcissist. So that's a real serious problem. But what he's claiming is that there's massive fraud, that they're mailing in votes from Bolivia and Ukraine. And, he's previously accused black people of voting twice. By the way, that's from, as you'll see in the book, from Birth of a Nation, the film 100 years ago, which was the paean to the Ku Klux Klan, where they showed white actors in blackface sneaking in that extra vote. So accusing black people and others of illegally voting is an old trope. But the truth is, and you'll see in the book, Lorraine Minetti, who's the number one voter fraud expert in America, has said that there are 12 people who've committed voter impersonation fraud, mail in by stealing someone's vote and mailing it in and signing for them. 12 people out of several billion votes cast in the past 6 years. That's it. So what Trump calls fraud, we don't worry about. What I'm concerned with is the fraud upon the voters. I just told you that the husband of the head of the ACLU got his ballot too late to cast it.
This is our problem right now. So I want you to protect your vote. Check your registration. You ain't getting the vote if it ain't mailed to you. Second, make sure that when you fill that thing out, that you make no mistakes, no smiley faces. And there's like fill in that bubble, fill in that envelope. A lot of states, you have to put in postage. You have to put the postage on. What they don't tell you, consider this. Think about Wisconsin. Think about Wisconsin, Amy. In order to vote, you have to have a witness signature in the middle of a lockdown. So number one, you have to have a qualified witness signature. You got to make sure that person's qualified. Second, you got to put the stamp on the envelope, but fill it out properly. But if you have to also include a photocopy of your ID if you're a first-time voter. So that's your students, your young people, basically your Democrats. And most people will miss that one, a photocopy of your ID. And are you ready for this, Amy? In Wisconsin, they don't accept the University of Wisconsin student photo ID unless you get the new one, a new special one that allows you to vote from the dean's office, which is closed, Amy. So if you somehow get that right ID, but that ain't enough. You not only got to put in the photocopy of the ID, you have to put in a letter. This is Wisconsin. This is the swing state of swing states that's going to pick our president. You're going to have to put in a letter saying you are actively enrolled and in good standing in your school. Now, excuse me, if someone flunked algebra, why do they lose their vote? I'm sorry. But now, and now add to this when you're mailing in your vote. If you mail in your vote and you have those 2 extra pieces of paper, what have you done? You're now more than 1 ounce. You better put on that second stamp. 100,000 voters in 2016 lost their vote for postage due. So what we have
to stamp at all, isn't that like a poll tax? Why should we?
Yeah. Well, very good, counselor. In fact, the ACLU just sued the state of Georgia saying this is a poll tax. Okay, this is a poll tax. And by the way, talk about a poll tax. In Alabama, where Doug Jones is fighting for his life for that Senate seat, and in Missouri, which is a swing state for the presidential election, you have to notarize your ballot. You like that one? Notarize it. Or in Alabama, you could have 2 witnesses. Now you're really going to get the virus. So you're trying to avoid the virus. But you talk about a poll tax, to get a notary, to find a notary, and then to pay a notary. This is it's absolutely poll tax. By the way, the courts threw that out. A lower court said you can't have all these cockamamie rules. But the U.S. Supremes only 2 weeks ago said, if the state says you have to notarize your ballot and put wolf's blood on it, they can do that. But they know who they're knocking out.
And we're speaking at a time, by the way, where Ruth Bader Ginsburg has once again been hospitalized. But I want to go to a bigger point, Noam. And as Greg Palast talks about this election, let's talk about what's at stake with this election. If you can talk about President Trump, talk about his admiration of autocrats, talk about fascism and white supremacy, what really will be determined in November?
Those are very important issues, but compared with the real issues, they're small. Another 4 years of Trump, we will very likely reach irreversible tipping points in the heating of the environment. If not that bad, it'll certainly become far harder to deal with the coming catastrophic effects of global warming. And it's not far off. While we're talking about these things, the polar ice sheets are melting, temperature in the Siberia has reached 100 degrees Fahrenheit. None of this is stopping. Trump, alone in the world, apart from some clones of his in smaller countries, alone in the world is dedicated completely to destroying the prospects of human life on Earth within a short-term period. If you're not living under a rock, you have to be aware of this. Maximize the use of fossil fuels, eliminate all regulations that somewhat mitigate the disaster and that protect people from the impact because it puts more dollars into the pockets of your main constituency. That's Donald Trump. That's only one. He's also tearing to shreds what's left of the arms control regime. Destroyed the INF Treaty, goes back to Reagan, eliminated the Open Skies Treaty, goes back to Eisenhower, now planning a nuclear test to break down the Test Ban Treaty 30 years, and putting frivolous barriers to prevent the enactment of the New START Treaty, a couple of months, that's the last of them. Meanwhile, developing new, more destructive weapons, essentially encouraging others to do the same to increase the threat of destruction to Americans. The military industry is euphoric. Huge contracts to build ways to destroy everything, then thinking about further contracts down the road to try to protect us from the comparable weapons that others developing. And military industry doesn't just mean the Lockheed Martin. That's suppliers, it's a large part of the industrial system. So they love it, just like they love the elimination of regulations, which enriches them. Beyond this, Trump and McConnell, who in many ways is the evil genius of this system, he's completely neutralized the Senate. The Senate used to be a deliberative body. It doesn't even exist anymore. Does nothing but pass legislation to enrich the super rich in the corporate system, and to pack the judiciary top to bottom with enough young lawyers from the Federalist Society to ensure that their sadistic policies will be unchallenged for at least a generation, no matter what the public wants. These are the kinds of things that are at stake. Yes, he likes autocrats. In fact, he's essentially, some of the things that are going on in Washington are almost indescribable. The inspectors general who were imposed by Congress, conservative Congress, Charles Grassley, to supervise branches of the executive, which to ensure there's not too corruption or other malevolence, started looking into Trump's swamp. He purged them. Gone. Went out of his way to humiliate Grassley, senior Republican. Not a peep from the remnants of what used to be a political party. It's now a bunch of cowardly sycophants.
Well, Noam, let me just throw in something from the book that you might find well, you've read the book, but there's a chapter, for example, with Billy Koch in it. And everyone knows David and Charles Koch. David's gone. Charles is there. But they were never Trumpers. And Billy Koch, the third billionaire brother in the family, he's the head of Oxbow Carbon. He needed the XL pipeline. He backed Trump to the hilt. People talk, look, Trump's, as I say in the book, Trump's not a billionaire. He just plays one on TV. So he needs real billionaires. He's the glove puppet. In the book, I try to give you some of the names of the billionaires with their fingers in the glove. Billy Koch, who very few people pay attention to, he used to get a little bit wasted and call me up when I was at The Guardian, by the way, and would rat on his brothers, detailing, Noam, you'll love this, detailing their felony crimes in the oil patch. I mean, I'm not kidding you, buying off politicians. He was really rolling. I happen to have my tape recorder on, so I give you some of the statements from Billy Koch about his brother in the book. But the most important thing is Donald Trump was actually hostile to the XL pipeline. Remember, it brings in foreign oil. It replaces American oil. But Billy Koch needs the XL pipeline because it's from the XL pipeline that he gets his carbon for Oxbow Carbon, this stuff that's so filthy you can't even burn it legally in America, and he ships it to China where it enters our atmosphere anyway. If we burn the entire tar sands, you're going to raise the entire Earth's temperature by 2.5 degrees. So he needed the XL pipeline, even though Trump was hostile. So he just purchased his way in, and within the first week, Trump authorized the XL pipeline. Because that wasn't because he's right-wing or hates the environment. That's because he had to pay back the guy who owns him, the guy that leases him, Billy Koch. And that's the story. It's money.
That's true. Let me add another word about the other Kochs, David Koch. If anybody who remembers back a decade may recall that John McCain, when he ran for president, had a climate change, a mild climate change program. The Senate was moving towards very limited actions to do something about this coming catastrophe. The Koch brothers heard about it, went berserk. David Koch was in charge, launched a juggernaut to ensure that the Republican Party would be pure denialist, wouldn't do anything to prevent the coming total catastrophe. Bought off senators, as you know, not that hard, intimidated others, launched a huge lobbying campaign, AstroTurf, pulled out the stops. Whole Republican Party turned on a dime. Ever since then, there's no global warming.
Noam, let me add something to that, Noam, which is that Senator DeConcini, who represented Arizona, he was investigating David and Charles Koch, and he busted them for what I was on this investigation too with the FBI, a massive theft of oil from Indian reservations, the Osage Indian Reservation. And literally, David Koch went to him and said, "You continue this investigation, I will spend whatever it takes to destroy you." And he did. He not only did DeConcini lose his job, he was indicted. I mean, and that was the operation of David Koch, literally. And so when other senators saw DeConcini's body on the political tarmac, they said, "Okay, Mr. Koch, our hands are up. We're coming out. Whatever you want."
Well, vote stealing is a very major blow against the existence of democracy. But as you just pointed out, the rut is much deeper. There's a lot of work to do to try to save a functioning democracy. We have a guy sitting in the White House now who people sometimes call a fascist. I think that gives him much too much credit. He doesn't know anything about what fascism is. He's a tin pot dictator, the kind of guy you see in a third world neo-colony where there's a coup every 2 years. This is basically what's going on with these things like the executive purges. By now the country's just becoming a laughing stock. And as you know, Europe won't even allow Americans to come there because of the way this maniac has, for his own purposes, killed over 100,000 Americans just to improve his electoral prospects.
No, explain that further. Trump's approach to COVID.
The approach was when he came into office in 2017, January 2017, within the first few days of his administration, he completely dismantled the pandemic prevention program, which had been installed under during the Obama administration, going back to the first George Bush, H.W. Bush. There was a pandemic prevention program in place. First days of his in office, Trump dismantled it. There were programs with American scientists working in China with Chinese colleagues to investigate coronaviruses. Incidentally, everybody in the scientific world at least knew that another coronavirus epidemic, probably pandemic, is very likely. Right after the 2003 SARS epidemic, they all knew this. And it's very striking to see what happened. Then every year in office, Trump defunded the Center for Disease Control and other health-related components of the government. This went on until February 2020, his latest budget, while the pandemic is raging, which he denied. It defunds the Center for Disease Control further and extends fund support for fossil fuel industries and for the military. I forget the word you used, psychotic narcissist.
Psychotic narcissist.
Sociopath.
That's an official diagnosis from the shrinks I spoke to at the Jung Center.
I think it's worse, but I'm not a professional, so I'll just give my sociopath. But he just doesn't care. If then, when the pandemic, we finally recognized the pandemic is here after 2 months late. Scientific studies shows that maybe 100,000 people were killed by the delay. Then what comes is just nothing, one crazy proposal after another, anything to try to improve his electoral prospect.
And improve his pleasuring the big money boys. We have actually a clip from Wisconsin. Do we have that teed up?
See, the burden is this. I go to register, and I don't know my name is purged. You tell me that now I need, a letter from my house, and I need to, I have to have the identification, but now I need the proof that I live there and all those things, and I have to leave and then come back. Now, the chances of that happening is probably going to be cut very low because of the frustration that they put on people and the burden of having just to go through all these changes just to vote. It should be easy to vote. I mean, I should go to a restaurant and say, hey, man, give me a burger and a ballot.
Exactly. That was
Greg.
That was the Reverend Greg Lewis of Milwaukee. And I was with him and with Sequana Taylor. These are people that they said left Milwaukee. You saw them there. Sequana Taylor isn't leaving Milwaukee. They're trying to purge her because she is the supervisor of Milwaukee. But if you look at it, if you look at these voter rolls, I mean, it's a pure Jim Crow list, and it's brilliant the way that they do this. They know who moves, like who moves. Low income people, renters, students moving couch to couch, room to room. That doesn't mean that you should lose your registration or your vote, but they know this. They understand how to run this Jim Crow operation, and it's true. They're stealing the votes. Noam, you're correct. It's not about voting. You're not stealing votes to steal elections. It's about the money. That's the point. And like in Georgia, for example, I said about how Brian Kemp, where did he come from? He beat, by the way, he beat out the Republican Party's favorite to get the nomination. Where did he come from? And why did he, for example, appoint this woman, Loeffler, as a senator? The answer was, she is on the board of Georgia Power, and Stacey Abrams was trying to block Georgia Power from spending billions of public money to finish a ridiculous nuclear plant. So it's all about maintaining that billion-dollar cash flow to the nuclear industry for Georgia Power, and to ensure it, to pleasure Georgia Power, he appointed this woman Loeffler as senator. And then the other big backer of Brian Kemp is Georgia Pacific. And they have this giant building. What does Georgia Pacific produce? Toilet paper. Why do they need a big building? Because it says Georgia Pacific on the outside, but it's actually Koch Industries owns Georgia Pacific, and that's their big center. And Brian Kemp is a partner, actually, with the Koch brothers, believe it or not, in clear-cutting Georgia pine forests for toilet paper, for pulp. It's the #1 pulp-producing state. So it's just follow the money. This vote trickery, vote thievery is a very expensive and sophisticated process. And these guys, Trump doesn't have the brain cells to pull that off. That's why he needs people like Chris Kobach of Kansas and other, dark, spidery brains to come up with his trickery. But so you have these brilliant systems, but it comes down to Greg Lewis, Pastor Lewis, and Sequana Taylor losing her vote.
So you talk about Jim Crow International, you talk about who's being targeted, but you also say that this is also about a class war. Explain.
Exactly. They, as I said, they go after African Americans, American natives, and Hispanics, because these are vulnerable groups. And basically, class war in America, race and class somewhat go together. And so you go after the vulnerable groups. So it's not like they're not the old redneck racists. A guy like Kemp, it's not a question of whether he likes or dislikes black people. He's not standing in front of a schoolhouse door saying segregation now and forever. He just knows that black voters, brown voters are blue voters. And that's what it's about. And he knows that if he has to pleasure the rich, someone has to pay. Someone has to pay Georgia Power for that nuclear plant. Stacey Abrams understood that. That's why she said no. She says, this is going to bankrupt the poor houses, the poor households of Georgia. Won't be able to afford this. But you're going to get the shakedown because so they go after the vulnerable voters, and then and then you also, when you win the election, you win the voting police. Who's going to bust these guys? Bill Barr? That's the problem. So it is about class. It's about America's resources, the world's resources. And so they go after those who don't have resources, which in America means voters of color and young people.
So as we begin to wrap up, Noam, if you can talk about what gives you hope and the movements on the ground. We've talked about power, who's in control of the White House right now. But this year has seen an unprecedented uprising in this country.
That's amazing. It's actually the biggest social movement in American history. Enormous popular support. Now, popular support is like 2/3 of the population, way beyond what Martin Luther King reached at the period when he was still popular. He lost his popularity when he moved to the North and tried to deal with racism and class issues in the North. But peak of his popularity didn't approach this. And furthermore, there's an enormous solidarity. It's very striking to see the black-white solidarity and the clear focus on policies that are very significant and that can be changed, and even moving on to their institutional roots. All of this has happened within a couple of months. It's pretty phenomenal. And it's not the only thing. I mentioned before the pressures that have moved the Democratic Party policies way to the left. So just today, in fact, Biden announced a $2 trillion climate policy. It's not perfect, but it's way beyond anything that anyone conceived of before. And the head of the Sunrise Movement, I forget her name, was one of the people who endorsed it. It's a serious program. Yep. Like I said before, it didn't come out of the heads of the DNC. It came out of the boots on the ground. And Sanders' role in inspiring a lot of it, bringing it together. Actually, let me... sorry. That's why the California Secretary of State had to steal the votes from Sanders voters. You can't let this kind of thing happen, this at the national level. But it is, because people aren't listening. It's like what you say about Colorado. They didn't listen. They overcame it. A lot of shenanigans to try to prevent the vote. Greg goes into this in detail. But the population was just able to overcome it. And it's being overcome by mostly young people, but plenty of others on the ground in Congress. And it's making a big difference. It's one of the reasons why, as Greg points out in an important chapter in the book, it's all of American history. There are efforts to try to impose narrow class rule, struggles against it over time with a lot of pain and anguish. They often succeed. So it gets to be a better world. And going back to Amy's question, that's what should give everyone hope. The story hasn't ended by any means.
Well, I should also add, there are many reasons to be cheerful. Keep in mind, the good thing about Americans, as our friend Daniel Ellsberg says, is that you have to lie to them. Unfortunately, it's easy to do. The good thing is that they have to steal the elections, which means that most Americans, if given the real free opportunity to vote, that the good guys win. Okay, we don't have psychotic narcissists. They're not freely elected. So you have to steal the election in a way that's good to know about the American people, but even more important, they can't steal votes, all the time. The trickery that was done in Wisconsin, changing the ID laws 2 weeks before the election to disenfranchise 50,000 African Americans without driver's license, to disenfranchise 182,000 University of Wisconsin students, yet Scott Walker was thrown out on his keister with all his money, with the Kochs behind him, with all the funky rules changes and the purges. And now you have Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, who brought Greg Palast into Wisconsin to help them fight the purge meisters. So they won in Wisconsin despite everything. You saw you were mentioning Colorado. Yeah, they stole 500,000 votes from Bernie Sanders. He still won the Democratic primary this time. They can't steal all the votes all the time. So if we protect our votes, they steal about 5%. Now that's 7 million votes. But as Obama told my co-writer at Rolling Stone, just have to overcome the steal. So if they steal 7 million, you have to have 9 million more voters. But I'm trying to tell you in the book how to know how they're stealing the vote. You can't stop a pickpocket unless you know that their hand's in your pocket. And the other is the ways to save your vote in the ballot contest. So how Trump stole 2020 is not about it's over with, go home, forget it, it's done, it's a fixed deal. The answer is that I'm telling you what they've done, and I'm telling you how you can undo it so that this time, let's try something radical, Noam. How about the American public choose the president instead of these tricksters?
Not only that, but keep his feet to the fire once you've picked him.
Yeah.
There's constant activism and pressure, no matter who's in there. Okay. That's real politics. Elections are part of politics, but real politics is what goes on the ground all the time, every day, not just every 4 years.
Exactly. And that's why, unfortunately, we can't be going to sleep every 4 years, and then they do the same stuff. They have a new system for going through the voter rolls. 16.7 million people removed this year, and tricks, like we had on Democracy Now!, my Rolling Stone report about interstate cross-check and Chris Kobach of Kansas, where they're removing. There's a chapter in the book, if you remember, Noam, called 358 James Browns. So in Georgia, they removed 358 guys named James Brown because they said they were registered somewhere else. Because believe it or not, they found a James Brown in Detroit and they found a James Brown in Baltimore. It's all the same voter, even though the middle names are different. James Edward Brown is supposed to be the same voter as James Thomas Brown. Okay? This was the trick that they were using. These are the tricks that they're using. We busted that, but now they've got a new one. That was created by Chris Kobach of Kansas, who's a star in the book, and you see me jump him too. If you can't remember his name, just think KKK. But this is what they do every 4 years, and we have the fourth estate, except for Democracy Now!, blessed, Tom Hartman Show and the others, Pacifica Network. But what we call mainstream here goes to sleep for 4 years. And then they go, oh, there's vote suppression. And by the way, that term vote suppression even annoys me. It's the weaseling word. When your car's stolen, do you say, my car's been suppressed? I don't think so. Excuse my sweat. But you don't say my car's been suppressed. We have to take this on all the time, not every 4 years when we go, oh my God, look what they've done to the voter rolls. And don't expect the Democratic Party to save you, please.
Well, Greg, congratulations on the book, and everyone should get a copy. How Trump Stole 2020, with comics by Ted Rall. And very quickly, those comics. Talk a little about Ted Rall's participation in this book.
Well, I was very lucky because Rall, just before I started the book, was fired by the Los Angeles Times because he was caught committing a crime. That is, lampooning the Los Angeles police for brutality against young Hispanic and African-American kids in Los Angeles. So he was literally fired. Now, how did he get fired? Turns out secretly, you'll love this, Amy, the Los Angeles Police Union pension fund bought the Los Angeles Times and fired Ted Rall for the cartoons about the police department. Like that? So he was a free agent for a bit. So I said, and he's a great investigative reporter in his own right. So he did the cartoon illustration, the 48-page comic book within How Trump Stole 2020, because I want to get it out any way I can. Comics, skywriting. I'm not kidding you when I say we have a techno track coming, and of course films, and whatever way we can get up. But I think that this is a good way to make the point, because they tell you it's a complex story. It isn't. It can be done in a comic book, really. You know, removing black people from the voter rolls, yeah, there's sophisticated new techniques, but it's a really old game.
So the book again, How Trump Stole 2020, by Greg Palast, with comics by Ted Rall. And Noam Chomsky, well, has written so many books, over 100. But one of the latest books is Requiem for the American Dream. Both are published by Seven Stories Press. Thank you so much for spending this time together. Folks, go out and get the books. I'm Amy Goodman, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Amy.
This whole election is being rigged. It's rigged. The election is being rigged.
It's totally rigged.
We're out, right?
We're out.